The film begins by informing us that there are 200,000 miles of pipelines stretching across the world's oceans. These pipelines are maintained by professional divers who are deployed to them using special diving capsules. This job is considered one of the most dangerous on Earth, as a diver could lose their life during an operation. The story of our film is based on true events. It begins in Scotland, where we meet a young diver named Chris. He's returning home to his fiancée, Morag, and tells her that he has a new diving mission the next day. He'll be away for a month. Morag seems worried about him, but Chris tries to reassure her, telling her not to worry because it's not his first time. He promises he'll come back to her and says that being a diver is kind of like being an astronaut. One explores the ocean, the other explores space. Afterward, Chris heads to the port where the ship is docked. He boards the ship, greets his colleagues, and passes by the dive team leader, Craig, exchanging greetings. Then he meets his teammate Duncan, and we learn through their conversation that Duncan has been a diver for 20 years and has a lot of experience. Chris heads to the locker room, where his teammates inform him that David is the lead diver on the ship. Later, the divers gather, and Craig starts giving them instructions and safety protocols. As usual, the ship's journey will last a month, heading to the location of the pipeline deep underwater to repair a malfunction. 4 days before diving, they must enter a decompression chamber to get their bodies used to the same pressure they'll experience at depth. Once the mission is over, they'll need to return to the chamber for another 4 days. The divers are divided into teams, each consisting of 3 people. Chris, Duncan, and David are assigned together. Chris tries to get to know David, but David doesn't say much and comes off as arrogant. Still, Chris welcomes him and walks away. Duncan talks to David and tells him that Chris is a skilled diver, despite being young. David responds that he prefers to keep things professional with the people he dives with. The divers enter the decompression chamber to spend the required 4 days before the dive. Chris puts up a photo of Morag above his bed. David asks who she is, and Chris tells him she's his fiancée and that they'll be getting married soon. David advises him to stay focused on the mission, explaining that when a diver is in the ocean, he must disconnect from the outside world. Once each team is sealed in its chamber, the oxygen starts flowing and the ship begins its journey from the port. Later, we see the 3 divers eating together. Duncan tells them this will be his last mission at sea because the company has decided to retire him after 20 years of service. When asked if he's upset, he says it doesn't bother him, but it's clear he's hiding how he really feels. Duncan talks to Chris and tells him he's a talented diver and that soon he'll be able to manage on his own without help. After a few days at sea, we see Chris looking happy, watching videos Morag sent him. She tells him she's waiting for him and reminds him to keep his promise and come back. When the ship reaches the location above the pipelines, Craig orders the first team to get ready and head to the diving capsule to be lowered into the ocean. The 3 divers suit up, and Duncan enters the capsule first. Before David goes in, he tells Chris that the 2 of them will be diving together, and that Chris must follow orders precisely once they're underwater for the mission to succeed. David then enters the capsule, followed by Chris. From the ship's control room, Craig communicates with them and begins lowering their capsule into the ocean, down to a depth of 300 feet. David and Chris put on their diving suits. David exits the capsule first, with a tether connecting his suit to the capsule so he can find his way back. Chris follows him, while Duncan stays behind in the capsule, which is his assigned role. Chris seems a little anxious, so David reassures him, telling him to move naturally and gives him some guidance to follow. They head toward the gas pipelines and begin inspecting and repairing the fault. Duncan communicates with them from the capsule and provides instructions. But meanwhile, in the ship's control room, a problem arises. The transmission system fails, cutting off communication with David and Chris down below. The crew scrambles to fix the issue, but shortly after, they're hit with another major problem. The ship's thruster systems shut down completely. Without them, the ship can't hold its position above the divers and begins to drift. Craig immediately instructs Duncan to inform the divers to abort the operation and return to the capsule quickly. Duncan relays the message. David orders Chris to drop what he's doing and move fast. They need to climb back up the pipelines as quickly as possible. As Chris climbs, his tether gets tangled among the pipes. He struggles to free himself And at that moment, all communication between the ship and the divers is lost. The wind causes the ship to drift further, pulling the capsule along with it. Chris continues trying to untangle his line, but he can't breathe properly. David orders him to use the emergency breathing supply built into his suit. This will only give him 10 minutes of oxygen. Chris asks, what happens after the 10 minutes? David tells him, grimly, that his tether will snap soon when the drifting ship pulls the capsule away. But he insists that when it does, Chris must get himself back on top of the pipeline, where he'll have a chance to be rescued. He tells him he has less than 10 minutes before his oxygen runs out. And, just as expected, the drifting ship pulls on the capsule, causing Chris's tether to snap. He plummets deeper into the ocean. Back in the capsule, Duncan loses all communication with Chris. He pulls on the line, only to find it has been severed. He's stunned. Meanwhile, in the ship's control room, the crew still has no idea what's happening below. They've lost contact with the divers. David, however, manages to pull his tether and make it back to the capsule. Duncan realizes Chris's line got tangled in the pipes and was severed, and he assumes, tragically, that Chris must be dead. Back in the control room, Craig speaks with the ship's officer, urging him to drop the anchor so they can stabilize the ship over the pipeline site. But the officer refuses, explaining that there are gas pipelines below and anchoring could cause an explosion. With the thrusters out of commission, dropping anchor would be too risky. He says the 3 divers below will have to handle the situation on their own. At this point, we learn that only 8 minutes remain before Chris's emergency oxygen supply runs out. At that moment, Chris lights a flare, completely disoriented and unsure of where to go or how. He tries to stay focused, relying on his training and instincts to navigate toward the pipelines through the dark depths of the ocean. Back in the ship's control room, the propulsion system comes back online. The officer talks with his colleague, trying to convince her to run the thrusters at full power to get the ship back over the capsule's location. She hesitates, warning that doing so might overstrain the system and cause it to fail again. But the officer insists they cannot let the ship drift further away. They need to remain above the capsule to have any chance of helping the divers below. She agrees, and the crew steers the ship back to its original position, stabilizing it above the pipeline site. Their goal now is to re-establish communication with the divers and figure out what's really happening down there. Meanwhile, Chris, still holding a flare, continues his desperate attempt to find the pipelines. Miraculously, he reaches them and realizes he has to climb quickly before his oxygen runs out. He tries with all his strength to scale the structure, but fails and drops the flare. He lights another one and makes a second attempt, managing to pull himself up onto the pipeline. But by then, his oxygen has run out. He begins to lose consciousness. In this critical moment, he remembers a video call with his fiancée, Morag, where she told him he had to return and keep his promise. Her words echo in his mind, giving him a final surge of strength. Though fading fast, he fights to stay awake. Back in the capsule, David and Duncan believe that their mission has changed. They now assume Chris is dead due to lack of oxygen, and they must retrieve his body. It's a hard truth to accept, but given the circumstances, it seems like the only outcome. On the ship, the crew tries to bring the vessel even closer to the capsule. One of the engineers tells the officer that he'll attempt to fix the communication system with the capsule, but it's going to take some time. The officer stresses the urgency. Every minute counts. Then, the ship crew manages to activate the ROV, remotely operated vehicle, that had been deployed with the capsule. It has a camera feed, and through it, they spot Chris lying motionless on top of the pipeline. His eyes are closed, and his oxygen supply is long depleted, but his hands are still moving. This baffles the crew. It's been 7 minutes since his oxygen ran out. Some speculate that it could just be involuntary spasms, and that it's only a matter of time before brain death sets in. Regardless, they know they have to act fast if there's any chance of saving him. Suddenly, Craig comes up with an idea. He suggests using the ROV's mechanical claw to grab onto Chris's dive suit and pull him back to the capsule. Although the ROV wasn't designed for such a task, Craig takes full responsibility for the risk. With intense precision, he maneuvers the claw toward the belt of Chris's suit and tries again and again to latch onto it. Finally, He gets a grip and begins to pull him upward, but just as they start, they realize something's wrong. Chris isn't moving. Something's holding him back. They quickly discover that he had clipped himself to the pipeline using a harness, likely to prevent being swept away by the current before he lost consciousness. Craig understands what Chris did. It was a smart move, and he tells the team they shouldn't blame him, even though it's now the very thing complicating his rescue. At this point, 16 minutes have passed since Chris ran out of oxygen. Back in the capsule with Duncan and David, Duncan begins to talk about a past incident where they had dived to recover bodies after a shipwreck. However, they couldn't find the last body. With nothing more they could do, they gave the widow a box of her loved one's belongings. Duncan continues, saying that he doesn't want to return to Chris's fiancée with just a box of his things. They must recover his body, or he will never forgive himself. David reassures him that they will not abandon Chris, and they will bring his body back to keep his memory alive. Meanwhile, on the ship, the engineer manages to fix the communication system, and they regain contact with the capsule. Craig speaks to them and informs them that they've spotted Chris on the camera. He's now positioned above the pipeline. David suits up to go down and retrieve him. Before he descends, Duncan tells David that he doesn't want to lose 2 divers, to which David promises he will return with Chris. David then descends into the water. When David reaches Chris, he unhooks the clip that was holding Chris's diving suit in place, ties him to himself, and pulls on the tether to bring him back to the capsule. This operation proves incredibly difficult due to the weight of their bodies underwater. Duncan communicates with him, encouraging him to take his time and not rush. After great effort, David successfully pulls Chris back into the capsule. Duncan performs CPR on Chris and is shocked when Chris begins to breathe again. Duncan, stunned, helps Chris up and allows David to re-enter the capsule. He tells him that Chris is breathing. When Craig contacts them from the control room and asks about the situation, Duncan tells him that Chris is breathing, but unfortunately, he is not responding to any other vital signs. Duncan tries to speak to Chris, pleading with him to respond if he can hear him, but there's no reaction from Chris. It's possible that Chris's brain has suffered clinical death due to lack of oxygen. Duncan becomes distraught and begins to cry. David then approaches Chris and speaks to him, asking him to give any sign if he hears him. Sadly, there is still no movement from Chris. They both come to the conclusion that they've lost him and that it's too late. However, in an unexpected moment, Chris speaks, calling out to David and asking if he's okay. Both David and Duncan are overjoyed and inform Craig that Chris is talking. The entire ship crew celebrates, seeing this as a miracle. They begin the process of raising the capsule back to the ship, and once they're back on board, they head to the decompression chamber, where they will stay for the next 4 days. On the first day, David checks on Chris and tells him that he had been underwater without oxygen for 29 minutes. Chris replies that the one thing that kept him from giving up before losing consciousness was his fiancée, Morag, because he had promised her he would return from the trip. David realizes then how thinking of loved ones can help a diver survive. He gets up to leave, but Chris grabs his hand and thanks him for saving his life. In the second day, Chris calls Morag and is happy to hear her voice. He reassures her that he's fine and tells her there was a problem while he was underwater, but he will tell her about it later. He promises to return to her in 2 days and hold her in his arms because he knows she missed him. On the 4th day, they exit the decompression chamber. Chris says goodbye to Duncan, as this might be his last mission. We see Duncan return to the chamber, sitting down, deeply affected, because it could be the last time he enters it. As for Chris, he returns home and embraces Morag, who is overjoyed to have him back. She asks about the problem he mentioned that happened underwater. Chris tries to hide the truth and tells her he had to save another diver who ran out of oxygen underwater. Morag senses that he's not telling her the full truth and asks if that diver was him. Chris admits it was indeed him, and Morag is shocked. He reassures her, saying that he promised her he'd come back, and that promise is what brought him back to her. We then learn that this is a true story, and Chris actually ran out of oxygen for 29 minutes, after which he didn't experience any health issues. This strange phenomenon has no explanation. The film shows real footage of Chris and Morag's wedding, with Duncan present at the ceremony. We also learn that Chris, Duncan, and David returned to the depths of the ocean for another mission, but this time they succeeded without any problems. And the film ends. If you love movies and movie recaps, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more. Hit like if you enjoyed the video and share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.